In the world of freedom, the proudest boast is, Ich bin ein Berliner.
After Germany's surrender in World War II following Hitler's suicide came the Yalta Conference in February 1945. Stalin, Churchill, and Franklin Roosevelt, the leaders of the three main Allied nations, decided that Germany would be divided into 4 zones, one each for the Soviets, Americans, British, and French. Berlin, Germany's capital, was entirely within the Soviet zone, but it was also divided into zones between the countries. But the morals of the Soviets contrasted sharply with that of their former allies. Soviet troops occupied much of Eastern Europe and began setting up communist governments in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and other nations. The portion of Germany controlled by the Soviets, East Germany, was also a victim of this puppet communist government. This harsh authoritarian rule led to many people, specifically intellectuals, fleeing the countries. As a result of the tide of refugees, who were generally valuable citizens due to their intellect, fleeing to West Berlin to escape communist repression, the Berlin Wall was built, signaling a triumph for the East's economy, but a general tragedy for the already building tension of the Cold War, as well as for the people separated from their loved ones. The separation of Berlin began in 1945 after Germany's collapse. The country was divided into 4 zones, where each superpower controlled a zone, which was decided at the Yalta Conference. The declaration was that the Premier of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and the President of the USA have consulted with each other in the common interests of the people of their countries and those of liberated Europe. They jointly declare their mutual agreement to concert during the temporary period of instability in liberated Europe the policies of their 3 governments in assisting the peoples liberated from the domination of Nazi Germany and the peoples of the former Axis satellite states of Europe to solve by democratic means their pressing political and economic problems. In 1946, reparation agreements diminished between the Soviet and Western zones. The West responded by wanting to merge the French, British, and American zones so as to revive the German economy. As stated in the basic principles for merger of 3 Western zones of occupation and other matters, the 3 High Commissioners together will constitute an Allied High Commission, and it is the aim of the 3 governments to restrict to a minimum the size of the supervisory staffs attached to their respective High Commissioners. The Soviet Union disliked this concept because it gave the one combined zone more power than the Soviet zone. This sharp contrast of ideals and desires when it came to power and government was a red flag indicating the future separation. On June 23, 1948, the Western powers introduced a new form of currency into the Western zones. This caused the Soviet Union to impose the Berlin blockade the day after. When Germany was divided into 2 parts, East Germany built the Berlin Wall to prevent its citizens from fleeing to the West. The wall physically divided the country into Eastern communism and Western democracy. The West did not necessarily understand the significance of the wall when the original fences and barbed wire went up. The border completely closed on August 13, 1961, during the middle of the summer, when many embassies and Western heads of state were on vacation. The GDR announced its approval of the Warsaw Pact and presented the construction, using contemporary communist rhetoric, as an anti-fascist protective wall. Armed GDR forces completely encircled West Berlin, and, after long and detailed planning, the wall went up. The West didn't have much ability to react, other than war, to oppose its construction. Despite this clearly difficult situation, the East definitely benefited from the wall as it caused an economic boom in their country. Though foreign aid played an important part in speeding up post-World War I reconstruction, financial assistance between April of 1948 and the end of 1954 was only 6.7% of the gross investment, which, because of the global depression, was already a low sum. In the early 60s, which is when the wall was built, there had been a renewed exportation of German capital, which amounted to $1.64 billion in 1959, and yet German prosperity continued to rise. Share values in Germany since 1951, keeping pace with the national product, had risen at an annual rate of 28%. This would not have happened if the economy lacked in the soundness and stability in population. The largest amount of the emigrants are within the age groups of 18 and 45. The urge to leave was great among technicians, professional men, and intellectuals. While the population of West Germany was growing before the wall, that of East Germany was declining. Because so many intellectuals were leaving the East, their economy wasn't nearly as prosperous. However, with the wall, they were essentially controlled to stay and work in the country, and thus the economy improved significantly. On the other hand, the wall worsened social conditions as relating to the Cold War. The wall separated East Berlin and West Berlin. In many ways, it was the perfect symbol of the Iron Curtain that separated the democratic Western countries and the communist countries of Eastern Europe throughout the Cold War. Technically, it prevented a war, as we know from Kennedy's famous words, "This is his way out of his predicament. It's not a very nice solution, but a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war." In other aspects, though, it made things worse. East Germany became a communist country under the control of the Soviet Union, while West Germany was a democratic country that allied with Britain, France, and the United States. The initial plan was that the country would eventually be reunited, but that didn't happen for a long time. The East German government didn't want to inform others that they only built the wall to keep their people in, so the USA, France, and Great Britain had no choice but to infer that it was another hit at capitalism. Those countries also refused to recognize East Germany as an independent country because of their goals and ideals. Another social detriment was the separation of people from their loved ones. When the wall was put up, crossing it became nearly impossible. People were put on waiting lists for years and sometimes still never given the chance to cross at all. Many came up with creative plans to cross the border, from shining mirrors into the soldiers' eyes to shooting firecrackers on them before jumping over, but they were an ambitious few and weren't always successful. In total, only around 80 people died from attempts to cross the wall, and because of the restrictions, it's easy to assume that this was because there weren't many people who were trying to in the first place. The Berlin Wall provided a triumph in the Eastern economy, but was a tragedy for many people, both politically and socially. However, it can be concluded that it was more of a tragedy than a triumph. On November 9, 1989, as the Cold War began to ease up across Eastern Europe, the spokesman for East Berlin's Communist Party announced a change in the political situation. Starting at midnight that day, he claimed citizens of the GDR were free to cross the country's borders. Sure enough, the Berlin Wall fell, ending an era that East Germany is still recuperating from as of today. The Berlin Wall is consistently brought up, and whether history views it as a triumph or tragedy, it is and always will be inevitably important to the entire world.